Catherine, if you want to go, please go ahead.
Oh, yeah, it's actually like 10 days after my due date. So
So then don't go to that. You'll
I
be
think I think I
I
think
was
I'm
just
just
hoping to get a signed copy.
oh no, that's a kind. That's a kind. I mean, we'll meet up. We'll meet up, Toby, here
Yeah,
in
for sure.
at some point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maggie says in the chat, hi Maggie. Maggie says in the chat that she'll be there. Yeah. So she's coming in from Australia for World Taiwan Studies Congress.
Yeah, May is a tough time for us teaching in Melbourne, in Australia, because our semester ends at the very end of May, so it's tough to escape in May.
it is. One can make a certain number of excuses with students and so on, but it does make life logistically very complicated if you're having to do makeup lectures and all that sort of stuff. It gets pretty heavy.
Yeah. Okay.
Um,
Now I hit the record button. Did it show up on everyone's screen? This is recording?
It did, yes.
Yes. Okay. Mark and Catherine, are you okay if we start now?
Go.
yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Thanks everybody for coming. Um, This is a special event, a special book launch hosted by the Australasian Taiwan Studies Association. And my name is Craig Smith. I am the president of the Association of ATSA. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And we would like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And of course, we extend this respect to any Indigenous peoples who may be with us here today. So today's kind of a special book launch for us because one of the authors, one of the co-authors, is one of our members. So this is an important event. The book in question is Revolutionary Taiwan: Making Nationhood in a Changing World Order. And if you haven't already bought this book, please check it out. I'm sure you'll have opportunities to buy it right after this. It offers us a rethinking of a lot of the names and the models of understanding and the very paradigms that we use to understand Taiwan and its relationship with China and the world. And I think it's written in a way that kind of connects to, for any of us who are interested in Taiwan, it hits on all of these main issues that we've been discussing for a long time. So it's a crucial text. A lot of people are going to ask about the title, Revolutionary Taiwan. And I like it because I know a friend of mine said, revolutionary. Are we calling this what happened in Taiwan a revolution? And for me, I'm a historian, so I learned about the idea of revolution from Thomas Kuhn. And he sees it as a shift, paradigm shift. So rather than a political change, it may not even be a political change. It has to be a change in our way of thinking. So I'm interested to hear how Catherine and Mark are going to discuss this. So I'll briefly introduce both authors. Catherine Zhou is joining us from Taiwan. She's at National Chengchi University. She got her PhD from Stanford in 2016. And Catherine has a very different background, not just limited to Taiwan studies, right? Also, a very comprehensive knowledge of British and European democratic systems. Can I say that, Catherine?
Yeah, my training is actually in early modern European history, so I'm a historian of the Reformation and the Renaissance. I'm not a Taiwan studies expert, and so that's one big reason why when I had the concept of writing a book like this, I thought I really need to look for a co-author and a partner in this endeavor who is a Taiwan studies expert and can bring that to bear.
What's going to be interesting to hear about how your background influences your perspective on this topic. I saw you have a book coming out or under contract with Manchester, Parliament in the British Political Imagination, 1550 to 1600. That's fascinating.
Yeah, so
So,
that's actually my dissertation book. So I was lucky enough to be teaching at a liberal arts college, Grinnell College in Iowa, which really gave me the freedom and the space to take a big detour from my actual area of training to write this book with Mark. So yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of my own background, I think another point that's relevant is that I am of Taiwanese heritage. I was born and raised in the United States. I'm a second generation Taiwanese American, and I grew up in a pretty political family. My father was a dissident student in the 1980s and left Taiwan for political reasons,
Mhm.
like many of his cohort of that generation. Yeah, so I think that's also the other perspective I think that I brought to this book. I
Yeah.
realized growing up that there really wasn't a need for um, not just one book, many books about Taiwan written for a generalist audience that nonetheless kind of were based in academic work and based in kind of deep knowledge and time spent here in Taiwan. And so writing this writing this book for me was in many ways also a personal journey. Um, it was the first time I was able to spend a lot of time in Taiwan and to work on improving my language skills, my reading skills, and also just like the opportunity to kind of um, have a lived experience here
Yeah.
and to bring those moments and those anecdotes to bear. So yeah, but I think finding Mark was like the big stroke of luck in making this project happen at all, getting it off the ground.
All right. Oh, that's great. It's wonderful that you two came together from different backgrounds to work on this book. We're more familiar with Mark in this group, probably. I think most of the people in this room are Australia based, and most of us are in the Australasian Taiwan Studies Association, which Mark is in. So I won't go into details introducing Mark, but I'll say, as many of us know, Mark works at the University of Tasmania, and that's where he's joining us from today. He's actually got to teach at 2 o'clock at UTAS. And he's definitely one of the best known names in Taiwan studies. And I think it's fair to say one of the few people outside of East Asia that has completely committed his research to a focus on Taiwan. It's actually quite rare. And for those of you who are not familiar with Mark, his monograph, Legitimacy, Meaning, and Knowledge in the Making of Taiwanese Identity, it's an important monograph for Taiwan studies in Australia. Mark, would you like to continue to talk about your background?
Yeah, so thanks for the invitation to speak today. My engagement with the Taiwan world began in the late 1980s and through the 1990s. So the first time I visited Taiwan was the early 90s. So as I said here, I started out studying Chinese language and then encountered Taiwan in the early 90s just as its flourishing of democracy was happening and was extremely visible to me in visiting there. And so then I chose to pursue a PhD at Monash University under Bruce Jacobs and Gloria Davies, two very contrasting intellectual figures in the landscape of the time. And For me, as we would all know, Taiwan is not well understood and historically hasn't been well understood in Australia. It has a very compelling story that needs to be told, and those concerns have always motivated my scholarly inquiry and a lot of the other things that I do these days in the kind of policy space and so on. In Canberra and through the National Security College at the ANU and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's a very rich and complex area, which always needs more work to be written and more thinking to be had, especially in the current moment, I have to say. We are in a period of great flux where understanding the countries of our region is more acutely important than ever before, I think. Yeah, shall we crack on?
crack on, Mark. Over to you two.
Yeah, so we've got a presentation here, just which sort of summarizes some of the key themes and some of the process of writing this book. So maybe I'll hand back to Catherine. We've been talking about the book already in different contexts, and so some of this, I think Phyllis, you mentioned you'd watched one of our presentations from earlier in the year, but I think it's useful just to give a bit of a lay of how we came to write the book and some of the things that we were thinking about in its writing process. So maybe Catherine, do you want to kick off?
Sure, thanks. So, as we mentioned, we were trying to pitch this book for a kind of educated lay reader audience. So, a reader who might be curious about Taiwan. And I think one of the things we realized initially in trying to situate the book is that there's such a rich and growing field of scholarly work in Taiwan studies, which I'm sure, like many of the members in ATSA, are kind of personally involved in pushing that forward. Um, yeah, I think a lot of these books are monographs or they're specialist articles and say that they don't necessarily surface and kind of reach the attention of a broader reading audience. Um, and so that was kind of one issue. I think the other thing I realized spending time here in Taiwan, so I was here over the pandemic for about 20 months. I managed to get my citizenship, my huji under what were then stricter rules for obtaining residency and household registration. I kind of just, yeah, it was my first opportunity to really um, get kind of acquainted with in a more intimate way how Taiwanese people spoke about themselves and their identity and their sense of home and what was this land that they lived on, what was the country that they lived in, how would they describe it? And there's a lot of insider um, fighting and debate. The discussion can really seem like a lot of insider baseball, and the parsing can get quite fine. And so sometimes the conversation, I think, is really not that intelligible to outsiders or to people who haven't spent time here or don't have a Taiwanese family or don't study Taiwan. And so I think that was another challenge for us in writing the book. Another way in which we were trying to define our niche was to say, okay, this is going to be really grounded in the scholarship, and we're tremendously in debt to all of the people that we cite in our footnotes and the bibliography. But it's going to try to synthesize some of these conversations and we'll talk about Taiwanese identity in a way that is, um, it, I think, intelligible to an audience that might not know all of the ins and outs of kind of how that conversation unfolds on the ground in Taiwan in a kind of daily or weekly sense. Yeah, so I think just kind of addressing some of the challenges um, that we've laid out here on the slide. So Mark and I wrote this book almost entirely through Google Meets. We met for the first time at an election rally for Tsai Ing-wen in 2020 in person. And then after that, because of the pandemic, um, we were really kind of grounded in our respective apartments and homes at that time. And so we traded notes and drafts over Google Meets. And so I think the book reflects both Mark's like deep engagement and study with Taiwan, starting from that transition from martial law to democracy, and then also draws a lot on the um, more recent time I was able to spend in Taiwan over the pandemic, when I was able to go to museums and book talks and pop-up exhibits and just like travel the island and walk the streets of Taipei, of Tainan, of Taichung, of kind of go around the island, visit Green Island and some of the other offshore islands as well. Yeah, so I think the book kind of draws on um, on sort of decades, Mark's decades of deep experience, and then also these touchstone moments, anecdotal moments that we then chose to anchor, to use as anchors for each chapter. And then we take these anecdotal moments from like the last 5 or 6 years, bring the reader into them, unpack these moments for the reader to try to explain, what are you seeing at this exhibit? What are you hearing at this press conference? When you walk the streets of Taipei, what is it that you're actually passing by, and how do you interpret what's around you? Sorry, Mark, that was a long, that
No,
was
look,
a long explanation, but
and I would just add to that, obviously we both have very different backgrounds, and that's certainly part of the dynamic of the writing process. It's a thing we talked about a great deal. It's certainly something that is very much at the front of my mind when I think about writing about Taiwan. I'm not Taiwanese, I'm Australian. I'm not American either, which is also, I think, a significant subjectivity. And so I think that question of who gets to speak, under what conditions do people speak and write about any particular topic is a really important one for Taiwan, and that's one that I think we both brought our different subject positions to the topic. Oops, sorry, going the wrong way. Where are we? Should we talk about our inspirations, Catherine?
yeah. So Mark and I first started to communicate on Twitter before Elon Musk purchased the platform, and there was a kind of thriving Taiwan Twitter community, journalists, activists, diaspora, people living in Taiwan, kind of just trying to raise the profile and the kind of quality of discussion around Taiwan. So I would kind of get into these like bruising, brawling conversations with people on Twitter. But Mark was someone I thought, gosh, I just really admire and connect with his work on this subject. And so Mark had written this piece in the journal Thesis 11 called Art, Violence, and Memory in Taiwan. And in this, he posits that the kind of missing element in a lot of discussions about modern Taiwanese history is the element of violence. So when we talk about Taiwan as a political miracle or an economic miracle, achieving a kind of evolutionarily bloodless transition to democracy, or achieving a kind of intense economic liftoff in the 1980s, that the element of violence is often missing from those stories. So the element of violence involved in the street protests and the kind of long-standing opposition to the authoritarian government, kind of in that period of white terror. So that kind of is hidden if you just talk about Taiwan as a political miracle or an economic miracle. And you also hide kind of the lengths to which many Taiwanese people were willing to go in order to fight for a multi-party democracy, a government that they felt would better represent them. So I was really inspired by this. And then I reached out to Mark and basically asked if he would take on this very lengthy unpaid project with me. And he agreed very generously. So we'll always be grateful for that.
And I became aware of Catherine's activism and remarkable commitment to engaging in substantive debates on social media with people who were not necessarily the most sympathetic interlocutors. And I think that spoke very positively about Catherine's character and just general resolute commitment to these issues. And Catherine has written a lot, but one piece really jumped out to me, and that was a piece about 228. Which talked about 228 as a revolutionary moment. And this is where the title of the book comes from. It comes from Catherine's, it's Catherine's concept and title. And the idea that we can think about Taiwan in terms of time specifically, and in terms of radical political moments through which the word revolution is incredibly analytically substantive and meaningful. And there are a couple of ways. One is the idea that the 228 is a sort of unfinished revolution. The idea that the transition to democracy is a kind of revolutionary change, and also it's an idea that runs through the book of Taiwan living in a kind of permanent sort of revolutionary moment, as it were, because the outcome of the revolution, which would be a recognized statehood in the international system, has yet to be achieved. And so for Taiwanese people and for Taiwan, it's this permanent sort of suspension of its temporal moment, as it were, before the resolution, which would be the achievement of nationhood as properly recognized. So Catherine's very complex and important reflections on that shaped how we frame time throughout the book. Where are we?
I had gone to Cuba on a visit, and I think visiting Cuba as an American, that of course, you know, I I brought kind of my own subjectivity to that experience. So it was in 2019. It was one of my last kind of pre-COVID trips. And while I was there were ongoing celebrations commemorating the 60th anniversary, the victory of the Cuban Revolution. And I thought about this and I thought, what does it mean to have victory in a revolution? What does it mean for a revolution to be over? And although, I mean, I think Cuba and Taiwan are, of course, in very different geopolitical positions, and yet there's some area of overlap. Um, a kind of diplomatic shunning that both have experienced, and sort of being kind of Cold War pawns in a way as well of major empires. Um, and so it got me thinking about whether we could apply this concept of revolution to Taiwan. And I think one of the things that's really like missing in discourse about Taiwan is that, as we argue, democracy created a different type of nation than existed beforehand. So even though Taiwan is called the Republic of China, in lots of settings, especially quote unquote official ones, and this name, Republic of China, is often used, right, as a way to deny that Taiwan is a kind of de facto nation or de facto independent. The Republic of China is not the same post-democratization, and it's not just because the form of government has changed, the type of government has changed, but who and what the Republic of China is, who and what it serves, who and what its army is supposed to protect and defend, who represents it, who speaks for it. All of that is different in a way that we would argue, I think, is revolutionary, not just evolutionary, post-democratization. So, who the people of Taiwan are, how they would describe themselves, how they would describe the place that they live in, as a kind of whole and complete nation unto itself, whatever label you want to put on it, and not just as part of this, a kind of peripheral, marginal part of this cross-strait one China. I think that is the big sea change that democratization has wrought. And as we kind of explain in the book, that's in large part because democratization was this experience of identity making and identity shifting as well. So it wasn't just about, sort of debates about what type of government should this polity have, but it was also a discussion um, about who this government would be for and why, and what type of nation, what nation this new government would be for. So that's one inspiration for the title of the book. And I think if you miss that Taiwan is a different country post-democratization, you've sort of missed like everything there is to know about modern Taiwan. It why it's a geopolitical flashpoint, why it's such a contentious issue in international relations. The second point of inspiration goes back to my own training in early modern European history. John Pocock produced this book called The Machiavellian Moment. It's this huge, like 600-page tome. But he's writing about the French Revolution and among other topics. But he's looking at this revolution, what he calls the revolutionary moment or the Machiavellian moment, which is the moment in which the Republic lives or dies. And this is how many of the people kind of involved in the French Revolution thought about the period that they were living in, that this is the moment in which the revolution lives or it dies, and it's always hanging in the balance. And I think Taiwan is kind of has been living in that moment, maybe ever since the 228 uprisings, that there's always this pressure in which democracy can be won or lost. The sense of nationhood can be won or lost. The survival of the country, the survival of the people can be won or lost. And that's a really particular, curious state of freedom to live in. And I think it explains a lot about why Taiwanese people, many of them are so invested in kind of declaring and restating and articulating and reasserting their sense of identity and nationhood, because it has to be reasserted and repeatedly declared and repeatedly kind of maintained in order for that revolutionary moment to continue. So yeah, thanks. Sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, no, yeah, this question of, I think all of us in the association wrestle with, anyone who writes about Taiwan wrestles with these questions of how do you understand it, how to understand it. Taiwan has these really particular methodological challenges as a topic of scholarship because it's an unstable signifier. It's so deeply contested. So much of the scholarly work required for Taiwan is about trying to fix its signification. I just want to say a couple of things about where we sort of went with method with the book. We're conscious that we went. I'll comment on the last point here, which is we wanted to produce something that was kind of readable academic. So that meant something that was relatively affordable, that wasn't a kind of $300 Routledge or Brill publication, but was in that sort of genre. We were a little bit inspired by some of the work that has come out about Hong Kong recently, which is also operating in the same space. There's a number of books that have come out about Taiwan in the kind of readable academic space in the last 12 months, including ours. We thought about the actual approach that we would take, however, and we didn't want to do a kind of narrative history, just sort of telling the story of Taiwan, starting, with the indigenous history and then the Dutch and the Zhenchengong era and the Qing and the Japanese. That version of Taiwan's history is now well established. So, but we didn't want to do that. We wanted to do something a little bit different. And so the approach that we took, and we can zap through the chapters in a minute, was to write starting in the present and take a particular event or a place and use that as a kind of jumping off point for trying to examine all of these really, really complicated questions that Taiwan presents. So, we had the DPP election rally win, the rally for the victory in 2020. Zhongshan Hall is a topic. There's the press conference that the PRC ambassador Xiao Qian gave in Canberra, where he was asked about the status of Taiwan. So just sort of taking these singular moments and then using those as kinds of points of entry. And one of the things, there's a chapter which is about Taipei as a city, and one of the things we thought about was, this is very much in my mind. If somebody who doesn't know a lot about Taiwan sort of lands in Taipei, they'll see a big kind of mega Asian city. There's lots of things to see and do, and there's lots of shopping, and it's lots of great transport and so on. but it's actually an incredibly complex place. And the complexity of Taiwan isn't always visible to the kind of casual visitor. So the book has one of its dimensions is to just sort of help someone who was going there to actually make sense of what they're actually seeing and understand at some level just how complex Taiwan actually is. So we did adopt a sort of fairly specific methodological approach, rather than and a book like Rebel Island, for example, that has come out in the last couple of years. Is it just a sort of straight narrative history? We did want to do something a little bit different from that. So we just quickly talk through the chapters, and then I'm mindful of time.
Yeah. And then we'll leave time for questions. I guess just one more word about methodology. I mean, Mark and I are probably like most of the people in this and in this participating in the talk are full-time academics. And so, we were teaching all throughout the writing of this book, and we're not journalists. And so we early on, I think, realized like some of the limitations we were working with. So we didn't have like access to kind of like top government officials, or a way to sort of shadow people as they went about their daily lives and kind of wait for 2 or 3 years and follow their story and use their stories, specific stories, life stories as a kind of a through narrative or anchoring point for the reader. We wanted to write the book fairly expeditiously, although it still did take about 3 years from first drafting to publication. And so that's why we used like these specific rallies or press conferences or visits to museums or walking tours as our anchoring points, which again will make the book has made the book different, I think, than some of the books that have come out or will come out soon by journalists and people who did have that kind of access or who were skilled at doing that type of interviewing and gaining the trust of their subjects. So so let's quickly run through. We can do this in like maybe 10 minutes or so, and then leave some time for questions, and then so Mark can go to his 2 o'clock students. So chapter 1 argues that the Taiwan of today was created through not one, but 2 struggles against Chinese party states. So it looks at modern Taiwan as both the product of these struggles against, on the one hand, the once authoritarian one-party Republic of China, and then so that we look at that period between kind of 1945 and the early 1990s, when the first direct elections for the legislature and the presidency were held. And then we also look to the struggle that has become more prominent and more visible in recent years, which is efforts against annexation by the People's Republic of China. So I think looking at Taiwan is this really kind of unique place that has so far, again, in this revolutionary moment, which is it's unclear how long this revolutionary moment will last, how long it remains open, but so far has defeated 2 projects by these Chinese party states to enfold Taiwan into this greater cross-strait One China project. Chapter 2 uses the National Museum of Taiwan History, so it's outside Tainan. And the chapter opens by talking about how if you want to get to this museum, it's really not that easy to do, again, for the sort of casual visitor. So you have to, if you were to land at Taoyuan International Airport, you have to take the high-speed rail down to Tainan, and then from there, a train or a bus into the city, and then from there, like a bus out to the museum. And it's located this very particular site, is a filled up estuary that had been used for trading in the early modern period when the first Westerners, when the Dutch arrived in Taiwan. So it is located like in a kind of historically specific area. The museum exhibit itself, the permanent exhibit itself, it was renovated and reopened in 2021. And then I made like 6 or 7 visits to go down in order to kind of start conceptualizing this chapter. Um, so we tell 4 stories, um, 4 ways of telling Taiwanese history based on the museum exhibit. And how does the museum exhibit tell these stories? So the first is through Indigenous history. The museum exhibit opens essentially with this plaque that says that Taiwan was a kind of free and unclaimed in a way, not unclaimed. I think the word they use is uncontrolled. Free and uncontrolled by any outside regime is the label on the museum placard. So kind of starting with this long-standing Indigenous history, and we kind of explore Taiwan as a serial colony, colonized, successively by different European and Asian empires, and how, if one were to, I think, take the perspective of different Indigenous nations, looking at Taiwan not necessarily as just like one singular island, but as a homeland for many different indigenous nations, who have really kind of interesting and unique ways of thinking about how Taiwan today should be governed, what kind of relationship they want with the kind of central or occupying state, what it would mean for Taiwan to kind of truly be decolonial, et cetera, et cetera. So the second story we talk about is this struggle for democracy, which the museum exhibition dates, I think, plausibly to the 1920s. Beginning under Japanese rule, with the foundation of these mass movements for establishing a Taiwan parliament, a parliament that would be based in Taiwan and have control over budgeting issues. The Taiwan Cultural Association, which worked to kind of raise consciousness and education level of Taiwanese living under Japanese rule. And so thinking about democratization not as something new, not as something, the desire for democratization and self-rule not as something new, but as something that's sort of a long-standing aspiration. The third goes back to our title, and really seeing 228 as this moment in which the first project for Taiwanese unification with China in the modern era fails. So there's a lot of talk, I think, in international relations about peaceful unification or eventual unification. And we argue, well, unification's already happened once in living memory, like that was my grandparents' era. And it was a disaster for the people living in Taiwan. They experienced corruption, repression, military occupation. Like that is what unification would look like. It would not be sort of this peaceful, gradual acceptance. And then the fourth, kind of curiously, sort of thinking that museum exhibit ends kind of in this way in which there's a lot of focus on like domestic problems in Taiwan today, labor issues, treatment of migrant workers, environmental degradation, overwork. So there's like a section dedicated to that, but what there isn't, there's just like no discussion at the end really of like the threat that Taiwan faces from the People's Republic of China. And that I think is such an interesting and curious choice by the museum curators. If I could ever like get them in front of an audience, I'd be really interested to ask them this question. And so they kind of don't address that Taiwan is in this precarious geopolitical state in which like today's freedom, cannot necessarily be taken for granted. Today's de facto independence can't be taken for granted. Yeah, and so I'll let Mark talk about chapters 3 and 4.
Sure. So chapter 3 is about the urban environment of Taipei, and it uses its jumping off point as Zhongshan Hall, which is the Japanese era, a building that's had many, many lives through the history of Taiwan. And then it uses the remapping of the city by the KMT after 1945 into to turn it into this idealized version of the Republic of China, this version of Chinese Taipei. So we use that label, which of course is used in sport, to talk about how the city itself has become this really a complex, multi-layered urban environment in which a version of China is laid across it, which has then been continually problematized through urban development, and that then speaks to the very complex status that Taiwan has internationally as Taiwan, Chinese Taipei, Republic of China, all those sorts of elements. And that's continued on in the last chapter, which is about Taiwan's place in the world, and it begins with that press conference where the AFR journalist asked the Chinese ambassador whether the people of Taiwan will have a say in their future, and he said, no, of course they don't. And so the chapter is about how Taiwan has this really complicated, it expresses the contradictions of the international system itself as it was created after World War II. And so the ideals of sovereignty, democracy, self-determination, those ideals coming up against China's hard power, and how people sort of have to live with that contradiction. So we all experience that very complex status that Taiwan has as the sort of countless sort of bizarre anxieties and obsessions around how Taiwan is represented internationally. So it has to use all of these really strange names, and anything that sort of that looks like statehood, China jumps up and down about. So it often seems irrational, but it's actually an expression of this very unstable geopolitical status that Taiwan has, which itself is an expression of an international system that was never really completed, or its ideals were never really realized after World War II. So it lives in this state both inside and outside the international system. Can maybe just wrap up with some where are we? What would you like to uh, yeah, I won't show this bit. Just sort of trying to think about Taiwan's place in the international system. But maybe just as a final comment, uh, the writing process was really complex, really interesting. We had a couple of reviewers, one of whom was really, really into the book and gave us a fantastic write-up. We had a reviewer too, who was very contrary and quite difficult to deal with. In the outcome of that was we added a prologue and an epilogue, which just sort of brought together the overall sort of narrative of argument. And in the epilogue, which Catherine wrote, it speaks about some of the problems that Taiwan faces, some of its challenges, migration, the conditions for young people in terms of economic opportunities and so on. So that sort of last section was just a sort of a counterpoint to these very broad arguments we were making through the book. But yeah, that was an interesting point dealing with that kind of reviewer, where at a certain point it was just about editing, not about actual reviewing. And so yeah, we had to sort of step in and say, okay, I think we're fine. Well, let's just press on and publish it. So yeah, a really interesting and complex process. To put it together and to deal with foundationally all of those questions about how we write about Taiwan, all of the choices we have to make at a really, really fundamental level all the time to tell this very complex story.
Yeah, I think so. We published with Cambria Press. Really grateful to them for taking on the book. I think as academics, you know, again, we're not full-time professional writers with agents, and so pitching to a trade press without a history of kind of writing big books for general audiences, that was really tough to do. And then when we were pitching to academic presses, their focus tends to be monographs and less on works of synthesis. So it was hard to find a publisher initially. I think that was one challenge. I think another challenge, as Mark said, we did go through a pretty rigorous peer review process. as well. Just another note about the epilogue, two notes maybe. One, wanted to talk about how the China cleavage or the China threat really impacts life in Taiwan today. So invasion may or may not happen, war may or may not happen, but what is happening every day is that the threat of war has like real consequences for life in Taiwan. Um, Arguments over how much should be spent on defense. Is Taiwan doing enough, quote unquote, for its own defense? Is it, quote unquote, taking responsibility for itself? Um, so there's that question. There's the time and the um, kind of life that young men here have to spend in conscription, which was recently raised from 4 months to 1 year. The sort of um, psychic space that is diverted towards kind of dealing with the China threat and sort of trying to replicate um, avenues for diplomatic engagement that for other countries that are recognized, mutually recognized, these pathways are sort of automatic. But Taiwan has to find a way to kind of mimic and make do with limited, unofficial, marginalized pathways. And I think also the sense of crisis, the sense of threat, um, also I think prevents a lot of people in Taiwan from thinking more broadly about Taiwanese identity. So many people in Taiwan don't want Taiwanese identity to be reduced to sort of Chinese ethnicity, and yet the citizenship laws of the Republic of China, which were created for China in the 1920s and 30s, and then kind of exported to Taiwan, rooted in Taiwan after 1945, um, you know, they they don't they don't really serve like the needs of modern Taiwan because it keeps citizenship so restricted on the basis of parentage and ethnicity. And in this era when Taiwan is facing like very low birth rates, like most of East Asia, and a really low rate of births out of wedlock, then what happens is that it's really hard to produce new Taiwanese people. So just at the moment, which historically, there's a historic high in the percentage of people who acknowledge themselves as Taiwanese, and yet creating new Taiwanese is really, really difficult. Low birth rate, restrictive immigration laws that kind of exclude like most foreign expats and certainly almost all migrant workers. So that's one thing. I think another thing about the epilogue is that we were aware we were writing this book in this moment in time. It was before the 20, it was before the 2020 like the election results for Lai Ching-te. I guess, well, no, I think it was like after. It was after the 2024 elections. So we had some sense of maybe politically where Taiwan might be headed, but also we're aware, that can change at any moment. It was before the second Trump victory in the US. And I think that really is, when we're talking about Taiwan, that really is the wild card factor now, is whether the sort of historic US ambiguous commitment to Taiwan, whether that will last during the Trump administration, and what the kind of determination of the Trump administration to burn American soft power and sort of burn lots of diplomatic bridges will mean for Taiwan. And um, and I think, yeah, it's been a struggle, I think, to watch a lot of Taiwanese people and a lot of Taiwanese diaspora, especially, like offer their, um, by no means all, by no means necessarily even a majority, but it's kind of substantial demographic of them offer their support to Trump in the hopes that he would change the international system and change the terms on which Taiwan had to interact within it. And he certainly is changing the terms, but whether that will be to Taiwan's benefit or not, I think is really very much an open question. Yes. Sorry, Mark, I know you have to go teach and we've got to leave time for questions.
I'm happy to take some questions for the last few minutes. Yeah, go ahead, Craig.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Mark. I do have some questions, but as there's only a few minutes before you have to leave, I'm going to open it up to everybody first, and then I'll ask my question.
Yeah, if I may.
Please go ahead, Toby.
Yeah, I'm just curious. So I have not been able to get hold of a copy of the book yet. The Kindle version is as expensive as the paperback version for some reason. Um, but just wanted to know how much weight, or do you give any space to the sunflower movement as a component of this revolution that we're seeing?
Catherine, go ahead.
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah. Let me just put this in the chat. Our publisher, Cambria, offers low-cost ebooks for $20. I'm not sure why the Kindle price is so high, but Cambria offers a PDF for $20. So I think that's the most affordable version that's
Oh,
out there.
great. Yeah, no, I
Um,
just looked at Amazon earlier.
yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much, yeah, for bringing that up. Um, yeah, so we talk about the sunflower movement in mostly in chapter 3. And we talk about how the sunflower movement um, in a sense is like both a continuation of but also different from previous mass student movements in Taiwan. So I think we could argue that the wild lilies in the late 1980s really were a major, like a visible public factor in pushing forward the end of kind of the martial law institutions and the beginning of direct public elections. Um, I think the sunflower movement's achievement is a little bit more ambiguous because once Taiwan has democratized, but before it can be recognized, if it ever will be kind of mutually recognized within this current international system, um, like what could the sunflowers achieve, right? And so their achievement, I think, in some ways is a little bit more um, ambiguous and contingent. So we talk about that, like the um, Freedom Square in Liberty Square in Taipei is named in part kind of after the wild lilies of the 1980s. There's no kind of similar public dedication or memorial to the sunflowers, and I think it again represents like that there are what we call asymptotic limits to democratization in Taiwan. Like, what can democracy do for Taiwan? It has done a lot for Taiwan, and yet can't um, it can't achieve formal international recognition, right? It can't achieve the uh, dismantling of the KMT, for example. I mean, these are just sort of examples thrown out there. Um, and so and I think, we saw in the most recent legislative election the defeat of a lot of the sunflower activists who had entered politics. And so is the sunflower impact, which was significant, which I think, it was a major, major factor in ushering in 8 years of Democratic Progressive Party control of the executive and legislature. Is that moment over? Um, yeah, great. Thank you so much for that question. There's a question in the chat, I guess. Mark, I don't know if you want to read
Sure.
it or tackle it. Yeah.
Question is, do you think that adjusting civic and public education in Taiwan is key to leading the island forward in terms of identity building? How can this be done under the fragmented political situation? I might just respond to that and say we do talk a little bit about education at various points in the book, including the Rensi Taiwan textbook debate and education reform of the 1990s. I think that's a long-standing debate in Taiwan. It's many decades of debate around the role of education in identity building, very contentious a lot of the time. Certainly in the 90s, it very much was. I would say in response, although the book doesn't argue this explicitly, but Taiwanese identity is very secure these days. I think it is. There's plenty of contention. There's plenty of discourse, and there's the blue and green, all that sort of stuff. But there is a kind of a set of norms have been secured that education is important to sustain. But I can't imagine would sort of dissolve in any pathway forward for Taiwan. Um, so I think all of that is important, but I think it already happens, and it's become, I think, normative in contemporary Taiwan is what I would say. Despite what looks, despite all of the noise and the acrimony, I always read that in Taiwan is actually pretty normal for a lot of democratic countries. In some ways less than say the United States, for example. So it's very much part of the story. But yeah.
I love this question. I think it's a great question. So kind of writing this book changed the whole course of my life. I um, fell in love like over the pandemic while I was here writing this book. Then I got married. My husband wanted to live in Taiwan, and so I searched for a job here, and now I live and work in Taiwan on a more permanent basis. I'm at, as Craig mentioned at the beginning, at Tsinghua University. So still getting to know my students and kind of what they think. So not speaking directly to that, but um, I think I think one thing in terms of identity building that is really probably critical for young people is to address their quality of life issues. And so Taiwan is an increasingly aged society, and that has all sorts of downstream political effects because there are, in a way, fewer young voters as a percentage of the population than in other democracies, and so despite the real split between blue and green and blue and white maybe on one side and green on the other, um, in terms of how to deal with China and how to kind of address the China threat. Um, I think all these parties are in a way sort of committed to like neoliberal economics with a um, at the same time that they're committed to a sort of basic welfare state. But bosses have a lot of power in Taiwan, landlords have a lot of power in Taiwan, and workers and renters have relatively little power by comparison. And so these parties, these big parties, despite their political differences, I think in terms of economics, um, there's maybe more overlap, or at least a perception of more overlap between them. And so I think, you know, for young people to kind of continue believing in the Taiwanese project, the Taiwanese state, it does go back to a lot of the issues that we discuss in the epilogue, which is um, how do you ensure a kind of thriving Taiwanese society and economy into the future under these conditions of kind of geopolitical threat, of conditions of low birth rates and low salaries and long working hours. And so I think education is one factor, but it's also, um, you know, are is are there going to be politicians? Is there going to be a major political party that really sides with the young and the kind of relatively economically disenfranchised over the elderly and the relatively economically empowered constituencies. So we'll have to see about that. Yeah, I think that's a major, major challenge.
Okay, thanks a lot, Catherine. Mark, I know you have to go. Are you going to run out now, or do you want to stay for another 10 minutes?
I wouldn't stay for another 10 minutes, so maybe just one more. Maybe Craig, if you had your question, and then
My question?
I could go up and talk to my small number of students.
Okay. I have a few questions, but one I think is relevant to a few people in this room. So I will ask that. Now, so changing the way that Taiwanese people think about their identity and their nationhood obviously is also the way they look at the world around them in other countries, and there's some positive examples and negative examples. So looking to Korea's own revolution, um, pretty positive, right? In terms of how violence, going back to your earlier comments about the connection with violence here, how violence led to something more positive, although that is obviously still an ongoing revolution. But then there's the very negative example of Hong Kong, which is very, very prevalent in the minds of everybody, especially people in Taiwan. And that's an example of how violence has ended up leading to, unfortunately, a system, even less freedom. So does Hong Kong and the events of the last 6 or 7 years feature in your book, and how do you think it has influenced Taiwanese people's thinking on nationhood and revolution?
I would just respond by saying it doesn't feature in the book, although I think it implicitly, both in terms of telling the Hong Kong story and telling the Taiwan story, I think there's some implicit connections there, but we don't make them explicitly, mostly because of just, we would the limits of any particular book. I would probably make a pretty sharp distinction, though, between the Hong Kong story and the Taiwan story. Um, Hong Kong had unification in 1997, but the history of Taiwan is such that that moment is not a possible one for Taiwan. It just can't happen historically. And unification with the People's Republic of China, however, if it was ever achieved, by definition would destroy Taiwanese society. And so I think the circumstances can only be compared up to a point. Um, and
Not trying to compare the narratives, but more thinking about how Hong Kong, I was talking to Phyllis and Maggie about it a few days ago, and just, there's so many people from Hong Kong now in Taiwan,
yeah,
and you hear so much Cantonese at events and on the street, and also people talk a lot, constantly following what's going on in Hong Kong. So I was just wondering if you think it affects how people think about violence, because since all these things happen in Hong Kong, we've seen big changes in
yeah.
Taiwan, like the Kuma Academy and things like that, for kind of mobilization of the people in the possible event of violence.
I think Hong Kong, it points to a particular future, which the people of Taiwan clearly don't want, and so I think it exists as these sort of these potentialities that loom over, as you say, contemporary Taiwanese politics. Um, I'm not sure though uh, there's enough violence in Taiwan's own political struggle for violence to be open to different interpretations. I don't think in contemporary Taiwan people would look at the violent struggle of 2019 and think, oh, we should never do that, because they have done it. There's been plenty of examples of that kind of very violent struggle. I think there's it more exists as a kind of permanent reminder of a pathway that the Taiwanese don't want, but that Beijing does want. And so it exists as this sort of potential future that the Taiwanese are working to, in one way or another, avoid. It's a salutary negative pathway forward. And I think it speaks more to that theme in the book, which is Taiwan is sort of existing in this potentiality of different futures. One something worse than Hong Kong, or the other one as sovereignty. There is a fundamental structural difference, though, between Taiwan and Hong Kong, and that, of course, Taiwan has a military force, and so it exists as a state in sort of in that definition, and so any kind of struggle would by definition be a military struggle, which I think does also create a very stark distinction between Hong Kong and Taiwan in that sense. I probably do need to zoom off. So thanks again very much for the invitation. I'd be very happy if Catherine wants to stay a bit longer and continue responding to some questions. But I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak, and welcome anyone to get the book and to give us their thoughts. I just make a final comment, which is the thing that surprised me the most about its reception has been the interest in the title. I thought the title was a great title. I didn't think, I think we were very committed to the title, but I didn't sort of imagine that it would generate the kind of very strong responses that it has, both, I wouldn't say negative, but the querying responses about whether Taiwan can be understood in that way. I see that as a great success. If people are prompted to think about how we tell this particular story, and if we're able to introduce a way of thinking about the history of a place using that word that's analytically and intellectually productive, then I think that's a great outcome for the book.
Great. Thanks very much, Mark. And our apologies to your students for holding
I'm,
you here.
I'm sure they'll get over it. I'll stop sharing. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks. See you, Mark.
Thanks,
Um,
Mark.
Okay.
Catherine, I'll just say
Um,
on the title that you've chosen, I think it's I think it's a good title. Like I was saying, for me, I think of Thomas Kuhn and the idea of revolution as changing the way we think about the world around us. So changing the way we think about our relationship with the nation and the state. And his examples, of course, he's looking at the scientific revolution. Think about there's a scientific revolution, an industrial revolution. Revolution doesn't mean that you have to have a complete different political state. But in the case of Taiwan, you do actually have a different political state. But more importantly, you have a different way of thinking about the nation and the state.
yeah, I mean, maybe I can just take like a second to address your question. And I also thought of something else I wanted to say to Hercules about um, education in Taiwan. And I mean, we do talk about this a few times in the book that Taiwan is like the number one target for foreign disinformation in the world, according to kind of various surveys done by think tanks that work on misinformation and disinformation. And so, you know, Taiwanese people are very addicted to their smartphones. If you like go anywhere on the streets, in the classrooms, on the MRT, etc. And so I think there is always this concern too that social media, and especially Chinese platforms, which are not banned here in Taiwan, like Douyin or Xiaohongshu, um, that that'll be a way to sort of influence people's thinking. I think that's a little bit it's a little bit hard to measure, but that's an element that is relatively new and stands outside the kind of formal curricular education that Taiwanese people receive now today under the Ministry of Education. The example of Hong Kong, we do touch upon it a couple of points in the book, talking about activists from Hong Kong who've moved to Taiwan, or visited Taiwan and wanted to kind of spread a warning, right, about their situation and not letting the Hong Kong of today becoming the Taiwan of tomorrow. That's kind of a slogan that you would hear a lot. I think on the other hand, this also goes back to some of the issues that we touch on in the epilogue, that Taiwanese people, many of them are also suspicious or worried about like people from Hong Kong potentially being like a sort of like like because many of them do have privileges and a kind of fast track to citizenship or household registration. And like there's a debate about whether they should be favored over any other set of immigrants, just because of this kind of element of Chinese ethnicity. So it goes back to that debate about there's a desire to separate Taiwanese identity from Chinese ethnicity, and yet an unwillingness to open up more formal channels for dual citizenship, citizenship without needing to give up your original statehood in Taiwan. And so I think that's where a lot of the conversation in Taiwan about immigration, whether it's from Hong Kong or elsewhere, is sort of stuck. It's like worry that if we give citizenship to people of Chinese ethnicity, that they will be kind of too loyal to China, and yet an unwillingness to or like even a lack of awareness about the necessity of reforming immigration law, so that Taiwanese can meet, kind of the labor demands and the societal demands of keeping a nation going into the future. Yeah. So, but thank you so much for these questions. Really grateful. Thank you so much for having us, and to everybody for joining us like on your Friday afternoon during a busy time of year.
Great. Thanks a lot, Catherine. We really appreciate it. It was great having you here. And yeah, everybody here, please make sure you click on that link and get the ebook, or ask your library to buy a physical copy of
Yes.
the book if you
Yeah.
can.
Yeah, it's available, I think, in about over 100 libraries around the world now. And so we're grateful to everybody who's either purchased a copy or asked their library to purchase one, or borrowed one from the library. Thank you. Thank you so much. It really means a lot to us.
Okay. Great. Everybody already applauded in there. So thanks again for coming. For everybody who's still here, we will have more events for the Australasian Taiwan Studies Association. Most importantly, in the end of May, I think the 28th of May, which is exactly 2 months from today, we will be having the film festival, the Taiwan Film Festival.
22nd,
22nd.
22nd to
Oh, sorry.
24th.
Of course it is. Yes. Thanks, Phyllis. Is there anything else coming up that we need to mention?
Now,
No. Okay. Okay. Once again, thanks to Catherine and Mark for a great book launch.
thank
Thank you. It was so nice to meet you all.
you.
Really appreciate it. Hope everyone has a good start to the weekend.
Thanks, you too. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thanks so much.